Thank you very much, Padmasambhava. That's great, thank you. Yeah, so I want to, anyway, today complete our cycle of talks about Padmasambhava. I don't know why I've got this lectern, because I've only got half a page of notes, but it gives me a sort of grand, doesn't it? Anyway, makes it look like I'm prepared. So I want to talk about enlightenment. So I'm very fortunate to have two little girls in my life. They're not little anymore. Alex and Ria, they're my partner's children. They're 14 and 15 now. But Ria, the youngest, when she was, I think, about 7 or 8, I had her for the day at the LBC, in the community and at the LBC. And I said, look, you'll need to come. I was giving a talk on an open day. And I said, you'll need to come with me for the talk. Do you want to sit, because does anyone seen top model drawing books? I mean, she used to colour in these top model drawing books. Do you want to sit in the reception room and colour in top model? Or do you want to sit in the main shrine room whilst they're giving the talk and colour in top model? She said, I want to sit in the main shrine room. I said, okay. Do you want to sit at the front with me or the back? She said, I want to sit at the front with you. So I was giving this talk, with a 7-year-old colouring in top model next to me. I mean, she's quite good at it. And she said, what are you giving a talk about? And I said, enlightenment. She said, that sounds boring. And it's so funny. I thought, it does actually, doesn't it? And then I said, how do you feel about this? Why don't I start my talk about telling that story? She said, she now rolls her eyes every time she sees me. She said, oh, all right then. So I started my talk telling this story, and there's a little boy in the audience about the same age, and I did the joke, that sounds boring, and he went, yes. With this kind of full weight of, at last, somebody understands me. So suddenly, Ria and this little boy were sort of like, completely agreed that enlightenment sounds boring. But actually, as so often with children, it's just true. It does. When you actually think about it, it does sound boring. It's a huge abstraction. And abstractions are implicitly, inevitably boring. And I don't even sometimes know what they are. They're kind of placeholders, aren't they? They don't really tell you anything. So I thought that obviously it's very important to talk about. So I want to try and talk about enlightenment. I called it enlightenment as power, and I want to explore that as we go along. I'm not enlightened, obviously, and I'm not sure that I've ever met anyone who's enlightened. I don't know. How would I know? I've certainly met people who I look up to very, very much, and have no doubt about the fact that they're in touch with some great mystery. I have no doubt about that at all, actually, and I directly experience it. It's not an abstraction like enlightenment, if you see what I mean. I don't personally feel motivated by abstractions, but I do feel motivated by people. And if I see people who I can feel and sense and know that they're more developed than I am, even very, very, very much more developed than I am, then that's all I need. Yeah. I have had my own experiences of a consciousness, to call it that, which is not quite right, because when you talk about consciousness, that sounds like you're conscious, and mind is much more than that. It might be better to say that a mind which transcends the physical senses and the rational mind, and transcends time and space. I have had some experience of that. Not as much as I'd like, but there you go. But I have had, at least particularly one time, I won't tell the story again, but one time when I experienced it very, very directly indeed, that there's a consciousness that goes beyond the senses, beyond the physical senses and the rational mind, and transcends time and space. Yeah. I don't have any doubt in that, because I've experienced it. It opened up and closed again, but I experienced it, and I've even experienced it a few other times in perhaps less dramatic form. Not so many years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine who I thought was dying, and he was very afraid of dying, and I just told him this story about this experience I had, and I said, so I know that there is something beyond the physical senses and the rational mind and time and space. I sort of know that. he found that very, very deeply comforting, as you can imagine. So the word enlightenment is very abstract, hugely abstract. It's nearly always better communicated, if it can be communicated at all, in stories. So my first story actually isn't to do with Padmasambhava. Recently went to see. I'm quite keen on Wagner. I went to see Die Walküre at the National Opera. And there's a scene in that, the first scene, where one of the Sigmund, he's sort of I won't bother you with the whole story, but he's a sort of hero. He is in grave need of help. He's now without realising it, he's in his enemy's home, without actually realising it, he's fallen in love with his sister, which is a bit problematic. We've all been there. That was a joke. Thank you. Suddenly YouTube closes down. One of the things that struck me about this time I saw it was, again, this myth of the sword. In this case, it's a sword in a tree. And the story is that his father, Sigmund's father, left a sword in a tree when he was born. I think I can't completely remember, but left a sword in a tree. It's that great story of the sword in the stone or the sword in the tree. And what really struck me listening to the opera this time was, in the story, all these great warriors come to, as they always do in that story, to pull the sword out of the tree. And it's always a test of strength, it's a test of heroism, it's a test of willpower to pull the sword out of the tree. And of course, none of them can do it. Yeah. In the Arthurian legend, I haven't revisited it for many years, but I think Arthur, as a boy, pulls it out, doesn't he? So a little boy pulls it out of the stone. Now, I think that's one of those great mythic forms, pulling the sword out of the stone or the tree. The sword is a remarkable image, isn't it, the sword? If you've seen the Mandragosha image in the atrium, he holds the sword of wisdom. So for me, and very often, the sword is associated with wisdom, with the cutting edge of wisdom. Yeah. But clearly what the metaphor of the sword in the stone or the sword in the tree is saying is that it can't be got by power. Like in Wagner's opera, you can't get it by power. In fact, it can't be destroyed by power apart from by a god, the person who made it. Yeah? So it can't be got by power, but the sword itself is another power. Do you see what I mean? That it's a greater power, that once you have this sword, you're kind of invincible. Yeah? It's a mystical sword, isn't it? I find it really exciting, this sword. I remember going to see a better production of this opera, and they'd somehow made it so that you didn't see the sword. And there's a moment in the opera where you get this music, that's literally called the sword music, and you've got the appearance and the sword and the word sword all happening at the same time. And they somehow managed to magically make this sword appear, this beautiful golden sword, and this incredible music, which is like the light on hitting the gold of the sword. And it's one of the reasons why you can get into Wagner, is you have these clasonic experiences at times of the archetype being made real for you in that moment, really quite staggering. It was like being electrocuted, I found. In other words, he presented you with the archetype of sword, of this mystical sword, that appears in the moment of need. And it's always to do with the moment of need, when you really need it. If you don't really need it, you can't get it out. You only can get it if you really, really need it. And you can't take it by force. And yet it's imagined always, I think, as another power. You've got the power of the warriors and the heroes who can't get the sword. Then you've got a boy, or you've got somebody in dire need, real need, and they can have the sword, and that's a greater power, yeah? So for me, that might be saying in my mind, as I'm thinking about this talk, something about enlightenment as power. Now, I say this quite cautiously because Bhante Sangharakshara, our founder, he was very uneasy about the language of power, and I want to rehearse some of that unease and my own unease about the language of power. But in the myth of the sword and the stone, it is a sword. It represents a sort of invincibility and majesty. So if I read that myth right, you've got power, worldly power, the power of the warrior, and you've got some other kind of power, some mystical power, which is this incredible sword, and it's invincible. It can't be got by force. Absolutely can't be got by force. In fact, you're more likely to be able to get it if you're a little boy or a little girl, innocently, and it's just for its beauty, not because of its power. And yet, it seems to suggest to me that a greater power, something both beautiful, majestic, and powerful, yeah? A new kind of power. And I think that the climactic story, at least in my mind, the climactic story of Padmasambhava meeting the king of Tibet, also brings up this question of power or power. Yeah? The power of the world and the power of enlightenment, and the power of Padmasambhava. And they're two completely different kinds of power. Yeah? So it's really power that I want to explore, I thought, today. That's really what I want to explore. And I want to explore this climactic moment. Got no idea what time it is. I want to explore this climactic moment of when Padmasambhava finally meets the king of Tibet. Yeah, so as Pranyamana said, he's spent a year, however long, a year and a half or whatever, travelling around Tibet, taming demons. And that's already striking. The king has asked him to come to Tibet. A king would normally expect that people would come fairly swiftly and even be terribly gracious and a bit obsequious about that they've been invited. But what Padmasambhava does is he goes around the kingdom of Tibet, meeting demons and converting them. Yeah? He finally arrives at what I always imagine as this palace, it's Samye Monastery. It's a palace, it's a king's palace. And I always imagine those huge kind of baronial halls that you see in Lord of the Rings and all that kind of stuff. You know, this massive baronial hall. And on one end, you've got the king on his throne with all his finery. And you've got, and in the story, you've got him and all of his retinue, his wives, many wives, beautiful wives around him, his courtiers, his whole retinue, all arrayed in royal garb. Yeah, so you've got this show of power, of privilege, you've got this incredible show of power and privilege, really. And then the door opens, and this man with this long red robe, and this blue robe, and this yellow robe, and this cap, and this staff, and this cup, he just walks in like a beggar, I imagine. Nothing remotely like a personage of royalty, like a beggar. You know, he's been travelling around Tibet, converting demons. He hasn't been in a royal court eating beautiful food and, served and so on. This man just comes in. You can really imagine it in Lord of the Rings. The doors open, the light from outside makes a path, and this man, this unfathomable man, comes in. This strange man with this frown and this smile and this flaming staff comes in, a bit like Gandalf, comes in to the room. And then, he's walking up to this huge array of majesty, royalty, prestige, success, attainment, achievement at its highest pitch. Yeah. And what happens is, as you can imagine, sort of filmically from above, this single figure is coming in on his own, and then the royal retinue steps forward, and the king separates from his courtiers and so on, and walks up to Padmasambhava. So you have to imagine that in the middle of this hall, Padmasambhava, just him and the king, just standing in the middle of this hall. Behind the king, all of his retinue. Behind Padmasambhava, nobody at all. Just the king and him. And in the story, what you hear is what's going through their mind. So the king thinks, so I have invited Padmasambhava to Tibet to establish Buddhism, for the good of the people of Tibet. But I am the king, so I've invited him, so he needs to bow to me. I am the king. You can imagine as well, he is a king, so he has his reputation to bear in mind. You know, kings can't bow to anybody. He is a king. He needs to hold that responsibility. And he also, I mean, I somehow quite friendlily disposed to him. He's trying to hold that responsibility. He also thinks, no, but I am the king. You're just a sort of shaman, some sort of beggarly shaman. You need to bow to me, yeah? And you hear this going on in the king's head, yeah? Padmasambhava, of course, walks up and thinks to himself, I am Padmasambhava. You know, end of story. I am Padmasambhava. There's no question that Padmasambhava can bow to the king. No question about that. So he comes up with, he just stands there in front of the king. So you've got this incredible standoff. You've got the king thinking, well, I can't possibly bow and I don't want to bow and he should bow. And Padmasambhava thinking, no way am I going to bow to this guy. Yeah. So you have to imagine this standoff. And my whole talk this evening is just trying to home in on that moment of a standoff and what that means. And then I'll finish with what happens at the end of that standoff. So what you've got in that moment, I think, Medina, you were saying how you really like this story, and I really love this story as well, and I think it's because it touches something very, very profound indeed. It's one of those stories, a bit like in my group this morning, people were saying how this whole thing of the demon being given a treasure to guard feels symbolically just right, but you can't always quite work out what that means in practice. What does it mean to know the name of a demon and give it a treasure to guard? You always know when you've touched a poetic mytho symbolic form, that it's got a kind of traction to it, but you don't always quite know what it means. It's got depth to it. It's got almost infinite depth to it. That's what symbolism can do. It sort of touches you in, but you don't always completely know what it means. You have to translate it almost moment by moment. And I think this meeting of the king of Tibet and Padmasambhava is like that. You can just see them come together. And then what does that mean? What has to happen here? Yeah. So I want to say that this is how I'm translating it today, and I'll probably translate it differently in my mind another day, it's the meeting, isn't it, between, you could say, between spiritual power and worldly power. It's again the sword and the stone. It's a meeting of spiritual power, of Padmasambhava, with worldly power. Yeah. It's also a meeting between the Dharma and the world. Yeah, it's a meeting between value, truly human value, and worldly pseudo values. Yeah, it's doing all of that at the same time. A meeting between genuine value and pseudo value. A meeting between the spirit and the world. A meeting between truth and deceit. It's that kind of archetypal meeting. It's a meeting between two kinds of powers, the power of enlightenment and the power of the world. Yeah? And the power of the world wants the power of enlightenment to bow to it. And that's always the case. The world always wants, in our case, the Dharma to bow to it. It always wants that, and always is trying to have that happen. That the Dharma, in our case, the Dharma, any kind of religious tradition, the world is always wanting to be above that, to get it to bow to it. So it's a kind of social and cultural moment where Buddhism meets the world, isn't it? But the Dharma meets the world. It's a kind of religious moment when the truly religious life meets the worldly life. I thought of it as where real value, real human value, meets pseudo-worldly values or false values, yeah? And I want to explore those false values. So you could think of it socially and sort of broadly, and you can think of it as a moment-to-moment matter in our own lives, can't you? Every moment of our lives, we've got that standoff between the world and the spirit, if you see what I mean, between what I want and what I need, between power over and power to. Yeah? That's another way of talking about two kinds of power. Worldly power is power over people. Power to is a spiritual matter. Allows you to do things. Yeah. So it's also a moment. It's an archetype because it's a moment-to-moment meeting. Who's going to bow to who? And often enough, I'm afraid, we bow. The Dharma bows to the world in ourselves. The part of us that wants truth, wants the adventure of the Dharma, wants freedom, wants honesty even. If we're not careful, we sell out, don't we, so easily to the world. But that's for good reason. It's very frightening not to. Yeah. Every moment in our meditation, every moment in communication, we're being faced by that standoff. Do I go for worldly success? Do I go for flattery, agreement, all that stuff to fit in to the world, or do I go for the spiritual life? Yeah? In a meditation, do I blob out and sort of rehearse an argument, or do I actually try and do this practice? Yeah, that's a nano moment by nano moment matter, isn't it? And it's at the deep. This is picturing that moment as an everlasting issue. Do I work? I'm in a bad mood. Do I work with it or not? I've fallen out with someone. Do I forgive them or not? And it's a battle, isn't it? Who's going to bow to who? Do I bow to the world and give in to the world, or does the world bow to me, as it were? But separating it like that is sort of false. They're both within us, aren't they? All of us want to do good. All of us want value. All of us want our life to be touched by the deepest meaning, and all of us want to blob out with Netflix. That's the good end. And we're very, very seduced by money, by achievement, by success, etc., etc. The king and Padmasambhava represent ourselves in the moment to moment, don't they? Yeah. They also represent the meeting, as I said, of Buddhism and the world. They represent the spiritual life versus the worldly life, and that standoff between the two. So the first thing to say about that, it is a standoff. It is a standoff, and it's never not quite. Yeah. So it's not that as you progress in the Dharma life, it all gets sweetened and sugarified into, I don't know what they embrace or something. There's always something of a standoff. Yeah. So I want to go through three little twins of things that I think might be a way of kind of getting under this a bit more, finding a bit more to it. Let's see whether I've succeeded. I don't quite know. I've written about 7 words about it, so I don't know why I'm looking at my notebook rather worriedly. So one of the ways you could imagine the king and his court is to do with privilege. Yeah? So it's a meeting of the spiritual with privilege. Yeah? So you've got this incredible array of privilege in its most kind of archetypal form, in royalty. It's an image for privilege. Now, as soon as I use that word, I'm very, very nervous of the word privilege. It's apparently, interestingly, it was the word that was used about the Jews before the Holocaust. People got it around that the Jewish people were privileged. And what that tends to mean is you've got it coming. Yeah? As soon as you say someone's privileged, it's got an implicit threat, usually. And it's interesting that was the language that was used about Jewish people before the Holocaust. Is you start to sneak that into society, that there's a group of people who are privileged. Because privilege tends to bring with it the association that they've taken it from someone. And they've taken it by stealth. And they're now privileged in that way. Yeah. It's a shame all these words are sort of getting weaponized, aren't they, in our life? But that's what privilege tends to mean. There's easily quite a lot of talk about white privilege or male privilege or, various other kinds of privileges. And it's not quite wrong. There is definitely something in that. I want to try and find a way of translating it, I think, in a more dharmic sense. So if Padmasambhava was to meet privilege, what I'd like to hear him do is translate the word privilege into the language of luck. Yeah. So all of us are tremendously lucky. If we're sitting in this room the day before New Year's Eve, but just before we go into we're tremendously lucky, unbelievably lucky. It doesn't feel right to call us privileged, quite, but we're tremendously lucky. If we're living in most parts of the world, it's unimaginably awful, and has been throughout time. We're just in this bubble where we forget that mostly. Yeah, if you lived in Syria, if you lived in so many other places, we're incredibly lucky, aren't we? I'm lucky, you're lucky, we're all lucky. If you can have a cup of coffee and a cake in town, you're part of a tiny percentage of human beings who can have that kind of leisure. Absolutely tiny. That's before we get into things like you've got clean water. I can't remember what the stats are now, but just people not being able to get clean water is unbelievable. Yeah. So, do you see how it's then called as privilege because of that? It starts to taste badly. It's more, I think it's truer, and certainly more Buddhist to think we're lucky. We're really lucky. Yeah. So if you're lucky, what should you do if you're lucky? Well, my teaching to the lucky would be, okay, well, you need to be grateful for that. Yeah. If you're lucky, you should be grateful for that. You're really fortunate if you've had an education, you should be grateful for that. If you've had parents who brought you up who haven't been a complete nightmare, or even if they have, you need to be grateful for that. I feel more and more grateful to my parents. They were very poor when I was young. It was hard work for them. We had five children and 2 dogs and countless guinea pigs, and a coach company to run. I feel very, very, very grateful to them. Yeah. So I think so you need to feel. I think to be lucky means to be grateful. And then, if you think of lucky being fortunate, then if you're fortunate, and this is, I think, where the word privilege is trying to touch on, is not to squander that good fortune. What a shame to spend that good fortune on yourself. That's really not. That's not right. That we can't be lucky and be in the receipt of fortune and spend it all on ourselves. That's not right. We can't even just spend it on our loved ones. So, really, I would say that if we're lucky, we need to be grateful for it and we need to give out of it. We need to think, okay, I'm fortunate, so I could help people more. I've got the resources to help people more. If I'm starving, or if I haven't got clean water to drink, or all the endless, unbelievable horrors of the world, then I can't help very much. But we can help a lot. Like every moment we can decide whether to help. Again, it's at every moment we can decide whether to be Padmasambhava or the king. We can decide to help and give, or we can decide to say, no, I just want it all for myself. I just want this good fortune for myself, so I get to wear these expensive clothes and be in this posh place. I'm just going to spend it on myself, like literally, but also metaphorically. Yeah? It's not fitting for a human being to do that. It really isn't fitting. So I think when we talk about, I think that a better translation of privilege is luck, good fortune, and that means that each and every one of us then have a job to do, as it were. We're given a treasure to God, which is to be grateful, I think, firstly, for the incredible fortune we've had, and to then make sure that we don't squander it, that we don't just do nothing with it. So really, I put privilege next to complacency, because this image of royalty for me is also an image of complacency, and that's what we really are trying to get at when we talk about privilege, is complacency, where people have money and influence and capacity, and they are complacent with that. Instead of using that for the good, they build city houses, all that sort of stuff. Really, I think what we mean is complacency. So I put them together, privilege and complacency. It's interesting that Bhante Sangharakshita, the founder of this movement, he says that complacency is a great danger of Buddhism. He said that's Buddhism's main danger, is being complacent. Yeah? Not really practicing strongly enough, not stretching enough. Yeah, he's got other dangers for other religions, but that's our danger. So I'm thinking that the antidote to privilege and complacency is gratitude. Yeah? You can't be complacent and be grateful. Gratitude is an antidote to complacency, and it's an antidote to privilege. Yeah? But it's also a real thing that we can all do. We can all express gratitude. We can all do that. I mean, there's so much to be grateful for. Most of it we don't even notice. You only notice when, like, the lights go off or something, or when whoever hasn't done the washing up, suddenly you notice that all this stuff is being done for you. Yeah? And my image of this, of meeting these words, privilege and complacency, and coming out of that with gratitude, is Queen Yang Chung that we were talking about yesterday. She would be an example of privilege, if you want to use that language. She's a queen. She's got a temple of jasmine, I think, a temple of jade that she invites Padmasambhava. She's clearly extremely wealthy in the Tibetan world. Yeah, so she's a very lucky woman. Yeah, she's like us. Actually, probably we're richer than her. She wouldn't have been able to sit in a room like this with it being warm, etc., etc. We're probably we live like Renaissance princes, really, in terms of our comfort level. It's like incredibly high. It's just that we've just all got used to it, and I have, you have, we all have, But it's interesting because actually, and she's really aware of it, isn't she? She's saying, I don't want to renounce all this, actually. I can't possibly. If you read into those lines, she's saying, I don't want to renounce all this, but I do want to practice the Dharma. Please give me a teaching. And she bows at the feet of Padmasambhava. Please give me a teaching. I really do want to practice the Dharma. I can't give all this up, but I want to take that on. Yeah. So she's a really good image of this, isn't she? Of royalty transformed. Yeah. She's a royal personage in this pantheon, as it were. And in this meeting, with Padmasambhava, privilege and complacency, what you get is someone who's very fortunate, dedicating that good fortune to practicing the Dharma. Yeah. That's a really good thing to do with your good fortune, is I'm going to do the best thing with it I possibly can. Of course, I believe, and you might not believe, but I believe the best thing you can do with your good fortune is to really practice the Dharma and communicate it to others, because people really, really need the Dharma. Yeah? So that's what she's doing. She's using her good fortune to do the best possible thing. And she's lucky enough to actually have the teaching from Padmasambhava himself. Yeah? So that's my first sort of image, really, is that the Queen Yang Chung, represents the best use of good fortune. And I'm trying to sort of take us away from this language of privilege and the threat that's buried in it, because I'm very conscious of that. Dionysus is a good friend of mine, and his family were killed in the Holocaust. I'm very, very conscious of the power of words to create demons. All you need to start saying is that there are these privileged people. Before you know it, those privileged people start to look like demons to you, and then you think you can kill them. Anyway, that's rather serious, so let's move on. So I thought the next thing, of course, that the royal retinue represent is power and greed. Yeah? Quite clearly, obviously, they represent power and greed, combined almost. They're dressed in incredible finery, in all of their royal regalia, and those are images of power and greed, yeah? In this fine monastery or temple or whatever it is that they're meeting in. And again, this word power has become sort of a dangerous word now. When I was at art school, I was just a little celebrity moment, I was just a bit of light relief. I was at art school with Damien Hirst, thank you, before he managed to do The Shark, and Sarah Lucas and all those sort of people. And when I was at art school, you couldn't get through a day without saying Foucault or Derrida. I mean, that really was the only way to get through a tutorial. Is said, Foucault. Derrida. I mean, basically that was all you needed to do. I don't think I ever met anyone there who'd read Foucault or Derrida, and I have not read a word of either of them. But in those days, they were all the rage. That was your ticket to serious attention, is just say Foucault. So helpful that he's French, isn't it? Anyway, so what Foucault and Derrida were rumoured for, I don't even know whether it's actually true, is seeing everything in terms of power and power relations. Yeah, That's what came out of those discussions of Foucault and Derrida, seeing everything in terms of power relations. This has now become a massive issue where things are being seen, almost everything can be seen in terms of power relations. And as usual, there's something in it, yeah? And I won't unpack it all because time is moving on, but as usual, there's something in it. My caution with it is that as soon as you take up a lens to look at the world, and we all look at the world through a lens, it creates a confirmation bias, doesn't it? If you look at the world in terms of power relations, that's what you'll see. That's what you'll see everywhere. Parents and children, men and women, different, everything. You'll just keep on seeing power relations. And that's because how you look at the world creates the world. We have this idea, don't we? And one of the great projects of Buddhism is to try and challenge this idea. We have this basic ground rock idea that we have experience, and out of that sort of pool of experience we come up with views and thoughts and perceptions and ideologies and theories. Actually, it's completely the other way around, that your views, ideologies and theories create your experience. Yeah. So if you always are looking in some way. Every time I've tried to talk to this, I never feel, I never feel I've managed quite to get this, but it feels like one of the most important things to learn is that how you look at experience creates experience. Yeah, it's a bit like how you see things, and the trouble is you don't know that you're seeing them through a particular lens. It's like they're like a fish tank. Your lens is like a fish tank, and inside that fish tank is a bit of experience that fits it. The rest of it isn't there. Yeah. So to give you a personal example, sorry I'm going on a bit, but to give you a personal example, when I was young, as a young man, when I was at art school, I could be the life and soul of the party one moment and very, very depressed the next. I was very, very unhappy as a child and as a young man, very, very unhappy indeed. But I was also naturally extroverted, and with the right wind behind me and with enough alcohol, I could be quite funny. Hard to believe. I remember I used to go to these parties, and I was always the first to get drunk, and then I could be funny but rather cruel. So why was I telling you that? Oh, yes, I remember. Fascinating though all that is. And for some of you, it's positively prehistoric. I actually had a strong sense from my early life, in a not very conscious sense, that people either didn't like me or they weren't sure of me in some way that I didn't ever quite, you never conceptualize your view. You don't think, that's what I think. You just move into a life that's shaped by that view. Do you see what I mean? I didn't think that. Actually, I had a classic kind of low self-esteem, which I had right from a child. I didn't think I did. That was just me, life, And then what would happen is I'd go to these parties at art school, and I'd go into the room with that sense of people might not be pleased to see me, might not like me very much. And what you don't realise is then that literally creates the experience that you're fearing. Because without me noticing, I'd come into that room looking a bit guarded and a bit unsure. People would then bring their own unsureness and guardedness to that, and I'd get my confirmation bias. I'd seem to experience a world in which people felt a bit iffy about me, a bit unsure of me. And that's because I felt a bit iffy and unsure about them. And it immediately created a world, yeah? And what I would do is when people assured me that wasn't the case, that they really did like me, I tend to think, yeah, but if you really knew me, you wouldn't like me. That's always there in the background somewhere. If you knew this and this and this about me, you wouldn't like me. Or I'd find some way to minimize that and say they're just being friendly and encouraging. That view do you see how that view shapes experience? As soon as you go into a room thinking people probably don't like you, that is what you'll see. Yeah? And this happens on every level of our life. So your view creates your experience. Yeah? The Buddha, interestingly, has no view. So experience is unimaginable with no view, because we don't have experience with no view. We hardly ever have even a taste of it. Yeah? So if you look at life in terms of power relations, that's what you'll see. You'll keep on getting confirmation of that. Another example, for instance, is if you think you can't meditate, you'll keep getting confirmation about that, won't you? If you sit down and you think, this is a really good thing to do, but I can't do it, every time you get distracted, you really notice it. And that confirms that you were right to think you can't do it. And when you get a bit more concentrated, you'll think that's just a bit of a blip. That's not serious. That's not really about me. That just, I don't know how that happened. I must have just got into the zone for a second. But it's not very important. But look, here's all this information that's telling me I'm right, I can't meditate. Yeah? So at every level of our life, life conforms to our view of it. Your view will create the life you have. Yeah? It's such a difficult lesson to learn because we don't realise we're moving into life with a kind of structuring that's patterning it all for us and presenting us to us in a way that fits us exactly. Yeah? Very, very difficult to see that. That's one of the reasons why we need friends, people who can help us see that you're bringing something to this. Never mind about other people for now, but you yourself are bringing a shape to this that's fitting you, that's suiting your view. Yeah? I find that very difficult to see in myself, and I bet you'll find it very difficult to see in you. So yeah, so that's why one of the reasons why I'm nervous of the language of power is this obsession, it seems at times, with power relationships. There is truth in it. There is a place where that is absolutely true, but it's becoming a toxic thought. Of course, the opposite of that really is greed. What really we mean by power is greed, that you want it all for yourself. Really, it's greed. And that's what power, in its naked sense, does, doesn't it? It grabs. It steals, it grabs, yeah. It wants for itself, yeah. Now my kind of teaching coming out of that is generosity. If you want to get out of that, that toxic tendency to see things in terms of power relationships and that toxic greed which is now fully destroying the planet, then the thing you can do, the thing that I can do is be generous. Generous with my time, generous with what money I have, generous with helping particularly spread value and meaning, spread the Dharma. Yeah? So the figure for this is actually King Trinzongdretsam himself. Yeah? So if Queen Yang Chung represents the fortunate person doing the best with their good fortune, putting their luck, instead of being complacent, putting their luck and good fortune at the feet of Padmasambhava to practice the Dharma for the welfare of all, the king himself represents power and greed in the service of something. Clearly he is the king, he wants to be the top dog, he is the king, he's invited Padmasambhava, he's a bit frustrated that he's not come, but despite all that, what he's wanting is right. Yeah? He's not a bad king. What he's wanting is a kingdom suffused by, you could say dharmic value, but a simpler way of saying it is truly human values. Yeah? That's what we mean by dharmic values, is truly human values. He actually, despite himself, despite his desire for power and prestige and privilege and greed and power and so on, he is trying to do something really good. Yeah? He is still trying to invite Padmasambhava into his kingdom. So do you see, that's a good example for us. Because actually, all of us, completely myself and everybody, I've eaten so much chocolate today, it's ridiculous. Anyway, all of us, never mind anything else, all of us have so much greed and want to get things our own way is another way of talking about power. We just want things our own way. We're all like that, but could we become the king and invite the Padmasambhava into our kingdom, yeah? And say, look, I know I'm like that. I know I've got my own greed, my own desire to get what I want, my own complacency, but I really do want my life to be suffused by dharmic values. In fact, I don't want just my life, I want my family's life, I want my community's life, I want the whole world to be suffused by those values, by truly human values. Yeah? At least he's trying to do that. He's doing it in a very imperfect way, because he's also dressed to the nines with his, he's also won't bow. So he's doing it in a very imperfect way, but he is doing it. And that's like us, isn't it? We're doing it, I'm doing it in a very imperfect way, but I am doing it and you are doing it. Here we are on this retreat. You are all trying to do it. You're trying to invite the Guru into the kingdom of your life. And you're trying to say to yourself, look, I know I've got my complacencies and grasping onto things and wanting things, but I do want meaning and value in my life. I do want truly human values in my life. And it's imperfect, but it's all right, isn't it? You can do that. That's what the king represents. And then there's another sort of duo, I think, in this standoff. So we've got this standoff, haven't we, between Padmasambhava, not representing, being the enlightened teacher, really, being this power to, being this new mind in the universe, and we've got the king who represents the world with its power, its privilege, its complacency, its greed, and so on. But the other thing that I was thinking that retinue represent is pride in identity. Yeah. So in that play Standoff, it's also a standoff with your own pride and your own sense of identity, isn't it? Because kingly robes and so on, and queenly robes, and they're all to do with they're status objects. They're trying to tell you who I am. The royal entourage are all saying, I'm a someone. Yeah? I'm a someone. Look at me. I'm a someone. Yeah? Padmasambhava is like a no one. They want to say, we're a someone, the king particularly, is saying, I'm a someone who you need to bow to me. I'm the king. Yeah? So it represents pride and identity. And it's interesting that Buddhism's view of pride is much more sophisticated than our usual view of pride. So Buddhism talks about the pride of feeling better than people, but also the pride of feeling worse than people, and also the pride of feeling the same as people. All of those are put down to pride. Yeah? Thinking that you're better than people, thinking that you're worse than people, and thinking you're the same as people. And you can see that, can't you? When you see people do sort of say, put themselves down, it is a sort of weird inverted pride. And you even see that when people, you and I are equal, it is actually a kind of pride, because you could say, how do you know? Equal in what way? It's such a weird idea as well. Equal. We're not even equal height. Never mind anything else. So we're all equal. You want to say, excuse me, what do you actually mean by that? Equal in what way? Quite. It's interesting. Buddhism doesn't use the language of equal. It says that we're the same, and by which it means that we have the same human need for the highest values. But it never talks about us being equal. It's such an odd idea. As I say, we're not even the same height, so I don't know quite where we get equal from. It's an idea that's very powerful. So it's any moment in your life when you're having to face your pride and face it down, where you're having to admit that actually this is me kind of feeling sorry for myself. And that's a kind of pride. It's a way of getting attention sometimes. When I was young, I've told the story hundreds of times, but my brothers were very cruel to me, and I really identified with being a victim of them. When I used to tell my life story, it was always about how horrible they'd been to me, and so on. But I sort of got something from that. It let me off all kinds of things, including, for instance, my own aggression. They were the aggressive ones and I wasn't. I was a sort of innocent, a hapless victim. Of course I wasn't at all. I was a bit of a nightmare in some ways, to myself as much as anything else. So the retinue also, as I say, represent identity. And this is something we need to go beyond. Identity, any kind of identity. When one of the reasons I came to London to come out, as they say. I was the only gay in the village. I think it was a bit bigger than the village, but it felt like that. Actually, I discovered there was lots more. But anyway, that's. About 20 years later, I discovered I missed out on all the fun. But anyway, never mind. I was the only gay in the village. And for me, coming to London was I didn't tell anyone about it. It was partly to come out. and for that not to be a problem. And for that time, identity was very important to me. I went on gay pride marches. I said Maggie, 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 out, 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 things like that in the street. And that's really changed the world, me doing that. I did all those things. Me and my partner, as I've sometimes called him, we ran the first, this is my claim to fame, we ran the first creche for the children of lesbian and gay parents. The only trouble was we were before our time, so we only had one child in the whole time. We were both sort of sat around this little boy saying, "What else do you want?" This is like really weirding me out. We were like long before our time. But I did need to sort of discover an identity, away from my brothers, away from the norms that I grew up with. But then I got stuck in that identity. I remember it being very sad. I thought that once I'd come out, I'd be really happy. Once it wasn't a problem. For me, being gay was actually a nightmare. It wasn't it was a nightmare for me. And I thought, if I come out and everybody knows about it, then I get to be happy and it's all fine. It made almost no difference whatsoever. I came out, I couldn't get a boyfriend, and things continued as before. So one of the things I've done in my life and wanted to do is let go of that identity. It's not that important, whether I'm gay or straight or anything, male, female, whatever. The Buddha is beyond identity, completely beyond all kinds of identity, including beyond the identity of being male or female, or even being human in the way that we would characterize that. The Bhante Sangha actually says it's more like the Buddha is a wholly new species unto himself. It's just a new kind of being in the world that we would hardly recognize. So really, if you can let go of pride and identity, all pride, feeling better, worse, the same, and all identity of any kind whatsoever, national identity, racial identity, gender identity, and so on, what you end up with is wisdom. Yeah? So really what you then end up with is Padmasambhava himself. Yeah? Because he's just coming on his own. He's been transforming demons. He's not part of any identity group, no style tribe, no courtiers, no nothing. He's just a living, breathing human being whose life is the Dharma. Yeah? So that's that moment, isn't it? This meeting of the world and the Dharma, meeting of truly human value and pseudo-values, meeting of two kinds of power. So they stand there, the two of them, and Padmasambhava thinks, well, I'm not bowing. And he does this incredible teaching, which perhaps we'll read tomorrow night, let's see, where he gives this incredible teaching to the king, this terrifying, incredible teaching. And what he does, it's quite striking, is he points at the king. He lifts up his hand and points at the king, and a ray of fire or light shines out from his finger, and it burns off all the clothes of the king and all the courtiers. Yeah? They say it's like a scythe that goes across corn. They all just immediately prostrate to him, and that's how the story, as it were, ends. He just, in a word, you see, the power of enlightenment in this mythic image is asserted over the power of the world. Yeah? This incredible power of the world with this great castle, this great palace, these great kingly and queenly figures. What Padmasambhava does is he strips them all, effectively. He scorches them. And it's interesting that he gives this incredible sort of scorching teaching. And the metaphor is like that teaching has just taken off all of that stuff. It's taken off their pride, their identity, their greed, their power, their luck or privilege, their complacency. It's stripped them back to the naked human being. Yeah? That's what the truth does at its best. It strips you back to the naked human being. Yeah? Without privilege, without complacency, without knowing, without power, just another person, a naked human being. Yeah? And they all prostrate to Padmasambhava. You know, they all throw themselves on the ground in front of Padmasambhava. And in a way I want to finish with that image, because I think that image, you know, there we have Padmasambhava on the shrine, surrounded by, you know, the darkinis and this incredible red. And you have to imagine all of these naked figures prostrated to him. And they're naked because that's the only way you can approach Padmasambhava. You can't approach the Padmasambhava really with power, with prestige, with status, because none of those things really mean anything. As I've got older, I've been more and more struck by that. I was talking to Luke this morning, one of the Lukes this morning, and you know, it sounds sort of boastful, but when I was young, if somebody had said to me, you'll have written 3 collections of poetry and 3 Dharma books, I would have thought I'd be so delighted by that, so happy about that. I would have never imagined I can do that. And yet, I mean, I'm pleased I've done it, but it means next to nothing to me. It's not here. And it's amazing that achievement is just pouring water into sand. It just disappears, doesn't it? You can do this wonderful thing, and the next morning it's just you again. It's just you again. You're just this naked, ordinary human being under everything. I always love this little story where someone said to Alex, when she was like 6 or something, she said, "Oh, if you went back to New Zealand, wouldn't you miss your daddies?" And she said, "I've only got one daddy." And this friend said, "But what about Maitreyabandhu?" And she said, "Maitreyabandhu is not a daddy, he's just a person." And I just thought, well, that's about as wise as you can get. You know, you're not a daddy or a mummy or a investor or a banker or a carpenter or a just a social justice warrior. You're just a person. Yeah, you're just a person, and it needs to be in that tone of voice. You know, so and so is not a lawyer; they're just a person. You know? And that's the only way you can really approach Padmasambhava, as just a person. And that's the only way you can really be friends, as just a person. That's what we want to be, nakedly just a person. And then Padmasambhava can teach us. Great.